Well, we have a little different kind of project today. We're going to be working on a 1973 Ford Mustang convertible. Now, the interesting thing about this car is that today's date is July the 24th, 2022. This car is 49 years old. It has about 21,000 original miles on it because it had been barn stored over 40 years due to a severe illness of one of the prior owners. The car is in almost perfect condition. However, when we lightly accelerate, the engine has a hesitation or bog to it. Now, typically, there are three things that can cause that, sometimes independent of each other, other times in conjunction with each other. The first is that the accelerator pump circuit in the carburetor is having a problem. The second is that on cars with an exhaust gas recirculation valve or EGR valve, the EGR valve might be opening a little too soon or a little too fast and cause a hesitation. And the third thing is that the ignition timing is not set properly, and so that can cause a hesitation. Now, there are a few other things that cause it as well. Less likely, but can. In the carburetor, the float level might be too low, and even with the accelerator pump, getting the gasoline up higher into the fuel channels for the Venturis takes a little longer because of the low float level in the carburetor bowl. And the other thing it could be is in the distributor we have a vacuum advanced diaphragm, and it's possible that it is ruptured. And yet again, there's another thing with the carburetor. From the throttle blades being closed at idle, lightly accelerating, we go from the idle fuel circuit to send fuel to what's called a transfer port on each of the two Venturis at a two-barrel carburetor. And it could be that there is some buildup of gum, old fuel from over the years that has been restricting the flow of fuel through those transfer ports, and so not enough fuel gets sent through them into the air being drawn to the carburetor, so we have a lean bog. So those are also possibilities. Now, last year, on an unrelated video we were doing, I had checked the ignition timing on this car, and I had been demonstrating how to test the vacuum advanced diaphragm to make sure that it is working, and that vacuum from the ported side of the carburetor is making it down to the distributor, and everything was fine. Even back then, I started to notice the hesitation. So I'm not ruling out the vacuum advanced diaphragm, and I'm not ruling out some of the other less likely suspects for behavior like this. I had demonstrated also last year how to test the ported vacuum going to the exhaust gas recirculation valve, and showed how to test the EGR valve with the vacuum pump. And when I put vacuum on the diaphragm, the engine started running a little rough. As soon as I released the vacuum, it snapped right back and was idling fine. I had temporarily disabled the vacuum circuit going to the EGR valve simply by unplugging it from the diaphragm port and plugging it. It made no difference in the drivability with the slight hesitation. It feels to me more carburetor related than anything else. I had also last year, when I was testing the vacuum vent circuit, checked the initial timing of the distributor, and it had been set for 6 degrees before top dead center, which is specification for this engine. Usually, back in the old days, when we had good gasoline with high octane, I would set the ignition timing for these 302 engines, or 351, closer to 10 to 12 degrees before top dead center, because that's when they start to wake up. But with the fuel octane we have for non-ethanol fuel being 90 octane, I can't do that and get away with it, even with a lower compression engine like we have in the 1973 Mustang with the 302 two-barrel. I believe the compression for that engine had been lowered that year to help reduce nitrous oxides to 8.5 to 1 or 9 to 1. High performance engines back then usually had 10 or 11 to 1, sometimes 12 to 1 compression, just to get more power out of them, but it causes problems with nitrous oxides going up, and got to get higher octane fuel, something that is becoming rather rare nowadays for alcohol-free or non-ethanol gasoline. Anyway, all that to one side. What I plan to do is off-camera pop the hood, put on the fender covers, and then have Linda record what I do in preparation for rebuilding and during the rebuilding of the carburetor, reassembly, starting the engine up and getting it up to operating temperature, and then setting the idle and the idle air-fuel mixture. And I'll be using some old school techniques for that, and I'll be staying largely within factory specification, again because with the low octane ratings for non-ethanol gasoline out in our neck of the woods, it is not easy for me to get anything other than 90 octane gasoline, so I got to keep the engine tuned to a lower state of ignition timing. Okay, we'll be back. After I opened the hood and Linda and I put the fender covers on to protect the fenders from any dropped parts or spilled liquids, Linda said, okay, where's the carburetor? It's a fair question, especially with a generation of car owners and repair persons who typically work in fuel-injected systems. They may not know what a carburetor really looks like, much less how it really works. And that's fine. There was a day I didn't know either. So in order to get into the carburetor, I first need to take off the air filter housing. And in this car, I have a cold air snorkel that already was unclipped from being secured on here, which is okay. It has an air fuel vapor hose that is foil and paper, leads down to the evaporative fuel vapor canister, which has charcoal in it, and its purpose is to hold on to unburned fuel vapors until the engine starts, and then the vacuum inside this housing pulls some vapors into the carburetor and burns the fuel vapors instead of them getting at the atmosphere. I also have a hose that leads to the crankcase, and one end and the other end plugs into a small port for a small filter inside the housing, and this is for airflow to come in as the engine's running, and the positive crankcase ventilation, or PCV valve, is sucking blow-by gases out of the crankcase. If it is pulling more out of the crankcase than blow-by is putting in, that could cause a vacuum in the engine, and with that we could have excess oil consumption. This keeps that from happening. It doesn't take much to tighten these air cleaner housing lids down. Air filter looks like it's in pretty good shape. It's not brand new, but it's also not the original. This is a Wix, W-I-X part, and Wix makes really good filters for gasoline, air, oil, and other products. We also have here a thermal vacuum valve. It has 2 ports underneath the air filter. One goes to this vacuum hose, and the idea is that when the engine is either hot or cold, it'll either send vacuum to a vacuum motor, or it'll vent off the vacuum and no vacuum gets to this little motor. Inside this housing, air inlet, there's a small door that when the engine is cold, it closes the valve in such a way that any air coming in comes from a small stove pipe that goes to the exhaust manifold. So it brings warm air in to the carburetor, and that helps to get the fuel to atomize better when the engine is cold. When the engine is warm, this vacuum motor, through this little valve here, will open, and when it does, it cuts off warm air from coming in and brings in cool air, because the engine will run better with cool air as opposed to warm air. I bring this all up because there's another vacuum hose connected to the bottom of their filter housing, and it goes directly to the intake manifold vacuum port. I just unplugged it, and there it is, right there. And this is the hot air tube for use when there's a motor blocks air coming through here, and it draws it through this hot air tube that goes to a fitting and stove shrouding on the exhaust manifold that warms up the air. This is the carburetor. Right now, it has a choke that is trying to close. It won't close until I open the throttle. Then it's gonna snap shut until the engine warms up, and the choke housing has a bimetallic coil spring in it that when it gets warm, it starts to open this thing up and it doesn't try to close anymore. So here, I just opened the throttle a little bit and this snaps shut completely. This pivot arm here, or pivot rod, is off center from the butterfly valve at the top for the choke. So when the engine starts and runs, there's more pressure on the one side of the choke than the other, and it tries to stay open a little bit so it's closed completely, because you still want air coming in. But when the blade is partly closed like this, the air-fuel ratio is more rich. But that extra richness doesn't ever get to the combustion chambers in the carburetor that easily, because the engine intake manifolds and heads are initially quite cool, and it causes the air-fuel vapors to start to condense. When that happens, the effective air-fuel ratio getting into the combustion chamber leans out a little bit and gets pretty close to the 14-to-1 ratio of air-fuel mixture. Now let me stop there for a moment. A lot of folks say that 14-to-1, 14.5-to-1 is a good air-fuel mixture ratio. And they say that means you're getting 14 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. That is absolutely wrong. It is 14 pounds of air for every 1 pound of gasoline or fuel, in this case, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, and at some moderate humidity level. But it's pounds of air to pounds of fuel, not parts. So that is a big misnomer, and I hear it said wrong, including in training manuals all the time. Pet peeve of mine, can you tell? Okay, back to the carburetor. To take this carburetor off, there are several parts I need to remove or unplug. The first is, in no particular order, the cold air inlet tube that brings cold air on the filtered side of the air filter down to the choke stove housing on the exhaust manifold. Next thing, electric choke. We have the electric choke heater wire, white with a black stripe. It ends up going down to the back of the alternator to the stator circuit. And what happens is when the engine is running, there is voltage from the stator applied to this choke housing, and it warms up the coil spring inside the choke housing and causes the bimetallic spring inside there to loosen up, and slowly the choke plate becomes open. Now there is a supplemental heater, that's what this is for, where there is vacuum coming into the choke housing, and it draws air from the carburetor to this down to a small stove on the exhaust manifold, and then the vacuum draws out warm air into the choke housing. That also acts on the choke spring to cause the joint to open up. So the hot air choke circuit and the electric choke circuit work together to open this up fairly quickly. Now the other few things I need to take off. Here we have a fuel filter, hose clamp, and fuel line. Now this fuel line and these clamps here are not original. I can tell because the original clamp is a crush type clamp, not a spring clamp like this. I also know because I'm the one that changed that fuel filter last year. I didn't do it because I thought the fuel filter was getting full. I did it to make sure that this fuel line never gets so old that it starts to get cracked and starts to leak gasoline, because that kind of gas leak is right next to the ignition distributor. And I have worked on a lot of cars where this was never changed, got cracked, leaked gasoline, gasoline caught fire, then we have an under hood fire. It's never pretty. Really, is there enough left of the car to make it worth rebuilding everything? I've done it, and typically my opinion was the insurance company should have totaled the car, but why would they listen to me? I'm just a mechanic. The other thing that we have to undo is on the driver's side, the carburetor throttle cable has to come off, and then the throttle position solenoid has a wire that has to unplug from the harness. I'll talk about that throttle position solenoid a little bit later on as we're putting the carburetor together, installing it, and I'm getting ready to adjust the carburetor. And you can come. There's actually two other things with the carburetor that have to come off before we take the carburetor mounting nuts off and then pull the carburetor. They are the transmission kickdown rod, and we also have a small vacuum line right here that goes to the ported vacuum port on the carburetor. That has to come off. Now, all of these are fairly easy to get off, except sometimes when these cars get to be this age, there's a little connector for the throttle position solenoid will sometimes get stuck, and I'll have to force that apart. Hopefully I can do it using a small screwdriver and prying it out. And the other thing is, for the fuel filter, I'm going to simply unclip a clamp here and then move that clamp up the rubber hose a little bit, get some pliers and move that hose back and forth to break the seal here and try to get this off. And I'll get gasoline dripping down there a little tiny bit, no big deal. Throttle cable is easy to get off. Well, I say that, now watch, I have a problem. I'll do it with the screwdriver so I don't block it too bad. Simply pry it off. And you notice that where the ball had been on the throttle went forward. That's because this is spring loaded. So when we get ready to put this all together, I'm going to, when the carburetor is dry, use the gas pedal to pull this throttle all the way back, and then make sure when I flip the carburetor wide open, it also is all the way back. I have seen on occasion cases where a wide open throttle inside the car did not translate to wide open throttle on the carburetor because there was some kind of restriction or binding somewhere along the way for the throttle cable. So performance never was where it was supposed or could have been at. Now the other thing is taking off the kickdown rod. Sounds like it should be easy, and it's almost too easy. You might not have noticed I barely touched the linkage on here, and when I touched it, this came off, the retaining clip. And I'm not sure why it came off that easily, but see how flat it looks? Looks to me like someone used some pliers and flattened this thing out. So when I get ready to put this together, I use a small screwdriver and spread this out to get a little more tension on here so it doesn't come off so easily. If it comes off, it's not the end of the world. The only problem we might have is, like in this case, all of a sudden the rod drops down behind the throttle mount, and then it can bind, not closing but open the throttle. The other thing is that if it's off, you go wide open throttle, there's nothing to tell transmission to drop down 1 or 2 gears for better acceleration. So performance is sluggish in the engine when you're going half throttle or more. Okay, moving on. Ported vacuum hose. Sometimes I used to need those pliers. Other times I'll try something else. I'm gonna try something else. Actually, and try something else. What I try to do is push on the vacuum hose while twisting it to try to get it to come off. That will help loosen whatever is causing it to be stuck to the ported outlet with rubber on steel. When they sit together for a long time, they kind of stay stuck, just the way it is. By pushing on it and twisting it, I'm forcing the rubber to kind of expand and pop off of its position on that port, making it easier to come off. Now, these vacuum lines are color-coded. This has a white stripe. That white stripe comes over to the top port of this thermal vacuum switch, and when the engine is under, I think it's 235 degrees or so, it sends a ported vacuum signal down to the distributor vacuum advanced diaphragm. Now, I have another video, which I will put the link in the description below in this YouTube video, that shows how the thermal vacuum switch works. They're also called ported vacuum switch, and how they are tested, and how to test a vacuum in its diaphragm. I'm not going to do it all in this video because it's already recorded somewhere pretty nice. Now I'm going to attempt to get the throttle position solenoid lead unplugged from the vehicle's main harness, underhood harness. Someone has done this before and broke a tab that used to be in place over here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They're probably trying to get the thing apart also, for some reason. Who knows why? I don't think it was me. I would have remembered. This feels like it might come out okay. There, that wasn't so hard. Probably because one of the clips is broken off already. It's unplugged, so I'm good there. Now I need to undo the fuel line to the fuel filter, and on the choke housing, I have Linda go to the other side of the car to show it. I have to undo the choke stove heater nut. Once that's done, I can undo the 4 nuts holding the carburetor down to the intake manifold and pop it off. Nope. Once the carburetor is off, I'll have Linda try to find for me a rag or two that are fresh, or paper towel, and use that to block the intake ports for the intake manifold so we don't drop something down there accidentally. Okay, I'll see you on the other side of the car. While we're working on disassembling the carburetor, I have come across this vacuum hose that I disconnect from the air filter with one of the thermal valves on it. This is a little bit shorter than I'd like. It makes it hard to put it back on later. So I'm going to try to put in a longer piece of vacuum hose to make it easier to reassemble this later. Meanwhile, I need to detach the hot air stove tube from the choke housing on the carburetor. There's a brass nut that's a 1/2 inch across the flats. I need to undo. I'll point to it and then I'll take it off. Right here. Now, this doesn't have to be put on real tight, but there have been times I've done these carburetors and find out some gorilla put it on really tight. Totally unnecessary. Because it's not usually tight, I'm going to use a regular open end wrench. If it was tight, I'd use a 1/2 inch flare nut wrench to take it off. Now, we have on the hot air tube a sheath. It looks like it's fabric and cotton. Well, it is fabric, probably cotton, but it is impregnated, if you will, with a compound that is no longer legal to be used in automotive, shipbuilding, military, etc., etc. And you can cut, I gotta think of the name of it. That mineral is called asbestos. Very small, minute particles is all it takes to get into a person's lungs to cause grief. And there is a condition called mesothelioma, which is lung cancer that's caused by asbestos being breathed in. And I say again, it doesn't take much. I have been exposed to it most of my young adult life. As far as I know, I do not have any signs of anything bad happening. I've been lucky. Anyway, I'm going to carefully take this wrench, put it over that brass fitting, and loosen it. Now take note, it's pretty loose already. I might be able to do the rest of this by hand. Right now I'm opening it up by feel because I can't see the wrench from my perspective. Your view and mine are both blocked. It's loose enough now. I can loosen it completely and then drop it away from the carburetor, making sure I don't nudge it out of its position at the other end of the stove choke going into the exhaust manifold hot air channel. Oh, wait a minute, there we go. I got it. Okay.
You didn't break it to death?
Now, nope, it's fine. I'm going to take this fuel line and apply a little bit of pressure and twist it to break it free of the metal port. Once that's done, I can sometimes pull it off, other times I need to persuade it. These nose pliers work really good for this. Let's work it off a little at a time, and that's it. Now, the carburetor is ready to be removed. There are 4 nuts at 4 corners of the base of the carburetor that have little stud nuts that I believe, if I recall correctly, 7/16 of an inch for the nut size. Now these don't have to be tightened ultra tight. They have to be firm to make sure we don't have a vacuum leak, but there's no need to muscle them so tight that it makes it hard for the next person to take off the carburetor. So what I like to do is use a 1/4 inch ratchet, because I can't put as much torque on that thing when I reassemble it that way. But sometimes, if another person had bid on this earlier, they will have made that such a tight torquing that it's hard to get the nut off. I got lucky with the left front, it's off. I'll put the nut here and go to the rear. Now I am going mostly by feel and memory, but that's proving to be difficult, so I'll move this linkage so I can get a better look at where I'm going. connecting with the universal joint socket in some ways makes the job easier, in other ways it makes it more difficult. This nut is on loose enough without a whole lot of grime on the stud thread, so I can take it off with my finger and thumb. And there it is, that's the second one. Now I'll come to the other side of the car. You might wonder what that rag is for. I'll show you in a moment. It's there for a really good reason. It takes me a little longer nowadays to move around than before because of my medical situation, but at least I can still move. It doesn't really matter what order I remove these mounting nuts in, as long as I get them off. That's all that really matters. Now that was really loose. And I wonder if this car might have had a vacuum leak all these years that went unnoticed. It won't happen when I put it together.
That's not causing this problem that we're having now, right?
In theory, it could have contributed, but it wouldn't have caused it.
Okay.
It would have had a condition more like a rough idle.
Okay.
And we didn't really have a rough idle with this engine. This rear nut is usually the hardest one to get because I have the hot air stove for the choke housing, all that tubing in the way. Fourth nut is off. Now, if I have forgotten something, I should be able to lift this up, unless the old gasket between the carburetor intake manifold is stuck. I don't usually see it happen with these carburetors, but I have had it happen. Nope. Pull it straight up.
Got one tube still hooked to it.
Haha. Linda's right. I have one vacuum line in the back of the carburetor still attached. So I have to unattach, detach it. Then I can get the carburetor off. Now, if I looked more carefully, and if it hadn't been 33 years since I worked on one of these things, I might have remembered to look there, but I didn't. And it is the PCV valve vacuum hose. Positive crankcase ventilation, PCV. It's one of those emission control devices that actually does good. So I will go to the back here. With the pliers, I'll twist and break loose that vacuum line, or at least attempt to, and then take it off. Now I need to swap positions with Linda so I can get back there. Maybe she can have a good view over my shoulder as I do this. This would have been easier had I thought of it earlier. Now, I've got to hold the carburetor still while trying to loosen this and get it off. There we go. It's off. Okay, now I'll go to the other side, and I'll remove the carburetor this time for sure.
The camera's jiggling. I'm also climbing. One thing we should have done is made a deeper garage. We made a third car garage to add a car, and we didn't go as deep as we should have. And this lift had to be in the second stall, and there's just not enough depth to get around the cars.
At least not easily.
I'm gonna go around your shoulder again.
Okay.
So that's your carburetor.
This is the carburetor. Now earlier, before we recorded this, I set up a punch and a vise. I did that so I can put the carburetor on it.
Ah, very smart.
Makes it very easy for me to work on it.
Okay.
But before I work on it, I need to block these two holes for the intake manifold so stuff doesn't get down there. I also need to remove this old gasket. I'm hoping the rebuild kit has another gasket that's thick like this, because this not only seals and prevents air leaks, but it also slows down thermal transfer of heat from the intake manifold up into the carburetor. Now I'm looking at the bottom side of this to see if it looks like it did a good job sealing. This is the left or the right rear corner. This is the one that was so loose. If I take a look, I see better clamping of the gasket here than here. So we probably had a very slight vacuum leak, so slight it didn't make any difference to the engine and its performance. But I'd like to look at these gaskets just to see, is there something else that was going on? Now this popped right off. The bottom side might also. It's gonna break off. It's been there for almost 50 years. If I can get the bottom and top both off, the rebuild kit has two of these devices. One gasket for here, one for below. Or if I can't get this one off, I can use one gasket, put it on there, and call it a day. Or I could go ahead and purchase a thicker gasket with thermal blocking. Might take a day or two to get here. My opinion, it'll only make a difference if I don't do it. So one way or another, I am going to go ahead and get this athermal barrier in there. Meanwhile, Mr. Safety says don't let anything get down inside the intake manifold that doesn't belong there. So I stuffed this rag into the intake manifold holes, so if anything drops, it won't get inside the engine and cause a problem. Okay, we're gonna pause here so I get the tools needed to pull this thing apart. I have brought a few tools over that I need to help take this carburetor apart. I don't have to strip it down to very, very base pieces, but I do have to take off some primary components. One of them being this fuel filter. I wasn't sure what size wrench I would need, Looks like 15/16 is it. These don't have to be real tight, they're pipe threaded in, but somebody before me put this one in much tighter than it had to be. The threads have run down a lot more than necessary to seal it from leaking. Oh, do we have another rag before I pull that filter off?
I got the paper towels on the other side.
Paper towels.
Hold on, I gotta pause it.
Down here, we have the accelerator pump nozzles. And when I open the throttle, we should get gasoline shooting through there. Don't know if you saw, but it's working. Even a little tiny bit of opening. So that tells me that the hesitation we're getting on light acceleration is probably not because of the accelerator pump, but because the transfer ports in the Venturis are not transferring enough fuel. Either because the fuel float level is too low, or we don't have enough gasoline inside the bowl for some reason, or the transfer ports are getting plugged up with varnish and gum after 49 years. If the car sat for any appreciable period of time with no gasoline in the bowl or gasoline that's drying out, that could cause it to get gummy. So now I put the towel underneath the fuel filter as I unscrew it, because all the fuel on the bowl could possibly come out. Now it didn't, because it didn't yet, because this channel goes up to where the needle valve seat is in here. Once I take that needle valve seat off, then the gasoline will come pouring out. This is fairly new, so we can reuse it. Now, Mr. Safety says, don't ever do anything that's not safe. Well, I dried this end of the filter off real good. I'm going to blow through it and see if it blows through easily. And it does.
Mr. Safety shouldn't have done that.
That tells me the fuel filter is not plugged. If I had encountered any resistance, that would mean the filter is dirty, has to be replaced. But then the question is, where'd the dirt come from? Ultimately, it depends on what is in here. If I really did not know and wanted to find out, I could use a tubing cutter and cut the shell of this filter off. Don't use a hacksaw. The tubing cutter will cut this without any metal flecking. Once it's cut, you can pull it apart and take a small magnet or magnetic blade screwdriver and touch the dirt and see if it sticks to the blade like metal would. If it does, what you have is rust, iron oxide. Usually because the fuel tank has had water and it rusted away the inside of the fuel tank, and that's what's plugging this. If, on the other hand, a magnetic screwdriver or a magnet is not attracting the crud in there, it's dirt. And that either comes from a fuel source like a fuel pump, where there was dirt in the gasoline that you pumped into your tank, or some nice person decided that they wanted you to have a problem with the fuel system and dump dirt inside the fuel tank. I've seen it happen. I've not ever done it. In that case, the proper remedy for either condition is to drain out as much gasoline as you can safely from the fuel tank. Drop the fuel tank after disconnecting all the rubber lines for vapor and liquid gasoline and the gas sender for the fuel level indicator. And then, if you want to try to clean it, that's fine. If there's rust in there, you'll never get it clean enough. It'll rust again later. The better solution is just buy a new fuel tank. Better yet, stainless steel. It's not that much more. When you do that, you get a new fuel sender, and on the fuel sender should be a new filter called the sock filter. With that sending unit comes a new square cut seal gasket that goes between the sending unit mount and the fuel tank. And you need to use a special tool to take that locking ring off. Now you can do it with a hammer and screwdriver and play around with it. It's better to get the fuel sender removal installation wrench. It's like $8 from NPD, or you can get from CJ Pony Parts or all kinds of parts stores. Replace the rubber fuel line at the fuel tank and the fuel pump. Before you put the new rubber lines in place, you'll need to blow fresh alcohol, ethanol alcohol, through the metal fuel line until it starts coming out clear. If you can't get it to come out clear, replace the fuel line, also the metal one. Before I take the top of this carburetor off, I'm going to remove the throttle position solenoid and the cold air choke cap from the choke housing. Neither of those have to be replaced. This I replaced about 2 years ago. The symptom I was getting is that after the engine was warm, the engine was running sluggish, misfiring. I was getting black smoke out the exhaust. Turned out the electric choke heater stopped working. When I would put an ohm meter on there, it showed total resistance. The current wasn't flowing, so it wasn't warming up, so the choke wasn't coming off. It was actually staying on when the engine was warm, and it caused a lot of excess fuel inside the air-fuel mixture, enough to burn, but it also fouled the spark plugs and caused all that black smoke out the back, smelled bad and all that. Ordered a new choke cap, put it on there, set it, worked perfectly. Now, to take the cap off, the first thing I want to point out, Linda will have to come over to see this, is that there is a small index score on the plastic housing between my fingernail and the screwdriver blade. It correlates to one of these notch positions. The center one with the big rib is 0. This is pointing to 1. I think that's 1 lean. Doesn't matter. I'm going to take my screwdriver blade, a corner of it, and just mark so I don't forget where it had been set. Now, if I was having a problem with this engine running poorly, cold, too rich, or too lean, I would be tempted to adjust that at some point. But this carburetor, other than the slight hesitation I've been getting, has been running well. Linda will attest to the fact that this engine starts easily when it's cold, and it idles well when it's cold. A little higher idle speed, which is normal. So it doesn't indicate I have to make any adjustments to the choke. However, I do see from the gasket that was between the carburetor and the intake manifold indication that this bolt or nut being loose didn't let that gasket seal fully. If it was a problem, it was a very moderate or minor problem because it didn't show up anywhere with how the engine behaved. So I'm not going to worry about that. My focus right now is to see if I can find anything in the accelerator pump or transfer port part of the carburetor that might have been causing the problem with off idle light acceleration hesitation. If I don't see anything that's obvious, there's a few things I can do. Put it together the way it was, or I have some linkage adjustment with the accelerator pump circuit I can alter to make the accelerator pump activate sooner and faster than it had with this current setting. The upside is I can do that. The downside is that in doing so, it means I'll be shooting more gasoline down the throttle every time I open the throttle, even a little tiny bit. That means less fuel economy. How much less? Depends. Doing a lot of around town driving, it'll be measurable. Doing a lot of interstate driving, probably won't even notice. This is a gasket used by the choke housing, and it's got to go in such a manner that it doesn't block off this warm air hole that has to remain uncovered. This has a bimetallic spring coiled up and then comes up at about a 85-degree angle. This metal part of the spring fits in between the two tangs of this linkage. So if the choke coil is tight, it'll close the choke up. If it's loose because it's warm, it'll open it up. So that has to fit right in the middle. So I'll put that to one side. Now, I could take apart the choke housing from the carburetor if I want. Some folks might think it's a really good idea. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. What I will say is that it really isn't necessary. There's nothing down here indicating that the choke linkage is binding up or is gummed up or anything else. It's pretty clean. And putting this in the carburetor dip with a nylon part isn't going to hurt anything. So I'll leave this alone. This is nothing but a dust shield to keep dust from flying back from the front of the engine and gumming up and dirtying up the linkage for the choke. Throttle position solenoid. I need to have Linda hand me the socket wrench over there. That's yeah, thank you. I can't remember the exact size of this nut because it's been so many years, or this bolt. I guess 9/32. I was wrong. I'll try 5/16. I hope it's 5/16. (9/32) also. Yeah. I'll get there. I used to remember these things by heart back in the old days. I used to rebuild several of these carburetors a week, sometimes one a day, simply because it's a popular carburetor, been around forever back then, and they were really pretty reliable. The only things that caused a problem were usually people trying to adjust their choke, not knowing what they were doing, or the power valve would rupture. And I'll show you the power valve in a few minutes. Meantime, I gotta take this spring off. I'll leave that hanging, doesn't hurt. Here, there's nothing really to clean up. I could spray this and get it nice and pretty, but there's no sense. This dust boot has a small tear in it. It isn't such a big deal that it makes it worthwhile to replace this or to seal that. I could seal it with silicone, but not worth it. That goes to one side. Now, accelerator pump cover is here. Inside is a diaphragm. There's a check valve. I'll show you that later. And inside here, there's a drop weight with a small ball that keeps the fuel from flowing from the accelerator pump jets back into the fuel bowl. Something in there somewhere is what's causing this to not get gasoline into there when the throttle is open lightly, or a transfer port. If I cannot get the problem remedied, I have a few other things I can do. There are 4 positions in this accelerator pump diaphragm arm. The further out I go, the less gasoline goes in there and the slower it goes in. As I move this in, it will increase how far this arm moves, putting more fuel in there and sooner. That's one adjustment. Another one is way over here on the linkage. This is the accelerator pump actuating arm. There are a couple holes in here. It is set to the lowest one. So that means that it's giving the least amount of travel, linear travel, per angle opened. I can move this up 1 or 2 notches and get more fuel in here faster than where it's at right now. Where it's at right now is ideal for economy driving if there isn't a problem with hesitation because of inadequate fuel getting into the carburetor. If I'm having a problem that I determine is because this has never been rich enough, my option will be to take this clip off and move this up 1 arm position, put the clip back on, and try it again and see if it behaves different. Probably will. I doubt I have to go to a maximum position on the arm or to an inside minimum arm position at the accelerator pump diaphragm. If I were to do that, I'd be putting a lot of extra fuel in there, more than necessary. It might cause other problems. So for now, I'll leave it until I take a look at the transfer port and see if there's anything in there that would indicate it was a problem. Now up here, I've got a small vacuum diaphragm that needs to come off. 1/4 inch. Lucky me, I had one. Sometimes these carburetor kits will have a replacement diaphragm, other times it won't. If this diaphragm looks good and I don't have one in my rebuild kit, I'm not going to worry about it. This is a choke pull-off diaphragm. But I don't see anywhere there's a place to make an adjustment, so if there's a problem caused by this, it's probably because the diaphragm will have ruptured. I don't know. Boy, that's tight. And that is tiny. This is going to be a problem getting put back together. But I have to remove it because I want to dip the air horn and the main body of the carburetor into a carburetor cleaning solvent. And if anything rubber is in there, it'll swell up and won't be useful again. So I've got to make sure this comes off. Looks like it should be easy to do, and it is. It's just tedious. Like so many other small parts of the carburetor, tedious. Get down here and carefully pop this apart. Because if there's not a problem with the diaphragm, I don't want to cause one by tearing this. Spring comes out. Now, there's a small hole with a slot cut that coordinates to the small slot here. I angle it there and pull this thing off. That's all there is to it. Now it looks to me like this is adjustable in the bottom. Because it hasn't been giving a problem and because the diaphragm does not look like it's torn, I'm going to leave it alone. Sounds kind of funny I'd say that, because I try to be pretty precise in things I do, but let sleeping dogs lay. Now this center bolt should have been down here somewhat tight. It wasn't. So this upper air horn gasket might have had a slight leak in the back. It's possible. It doesn't have to be tight like a gorilla, just enough to keep the gasket from leaking. And then the air horn screws.
What do you call it, an air horn? There's no horn in there.
No, but this is called the air horn, where the air comes in.
Got it.
But you're right, it's not like a horn like honk honk. Although, at a wide open throttle, you get some interesting sounds coming from the intake port of the intake manifold and the air horn of the carburetor. Maybe that's why I call it a horn, because it makes a loud roaring sound. When the air filter housing is on here with an air cleaner all in an enclosed shell, it kind of takes a lot of that sound away. You don't hear it as much. But if I were to take the air filter housing lid and flip it so that around the circumference there's a gap for air to flow into, you would definitely hear a difference at a wide open throttle. The thing would roar. Now, this carburetor has original ID tag on it, not with a part number, but with an engineering specification, D30FEA. D, the 70th decade, 3, so it's a 73 OFEA something, and then in the middle would typically be a base number. I don't remember the base number of these carburetors offhand, but whatever it is, often when we get parts for this carburetor, I either need to know exactly what it came off of originally, or get this tag number to find the right rebuild kit. Now, this should pop right off, and it does. The choke linkage is attached, and it also has a small tang on the end of the connecting rod and a small slot in the choke arm hole. So when I take this off, I need to rotate this in such a manner, if I can, that I can get that off. Well, I can't, so what I'm going to do is get a Phillips screwdriver and unscrew this end of the choke driver. Linda was nice enough to fetch it for me. Now, while she was fetching it, I took a closer look at this diaphragm and what it seems to do. Now I remember. Okay, that is off. This arm can now pop off. But I need to do something to make sure I don't lose these parts.
Screw it back on.
So I put it back in place. And then run the screw down once again to hold it in place. Again, not hard, just tedious, tiny little parts. Making things more difficult as my vision isn't nearly as good as it used to be. I don't have to make it real tight. I want to make it snug enough so it doesn't undo itself and come off. So here's what I figured out about this diaphragm. It's a choke pull-off. When the choke is set closed, this will get vacuum, pull down, and open with linkage over here. And how far it opens that will depend upon where this little screw is set. Because it's been running so well, I'm going to leave it alone. There's no sense in me screwing with something that's been working well for many years. Now I take the air horn off. Here is that set screw adjusting and has a slot in there for a small screwdriver to make this go up and down to adjust how far it's going to pull this choke off when it activates. I'm going to leave it alone. Now I'm looking to see if there's anything obvious like a crack or an indication of vacuum leak, which would be dirt along an edge here because it pulled air through that was unfiltered or filtered. I don't see any indication here of a vacuum leak. That goes to one side. Then I want to look at the gasket. And here I'm checking to see if there's any indication that there was a bad seal. And so far, looks like even back here with that one center bolt loose, it was sealing. I don't see any indication of leakage.
A little divot right here under your thumb, right in there. Is that anything or no?
No big deal.
Not anything?
Nah, just dirt that built up. Other side of the gasket, look at the same thing. It looks like around the whole perimeter, the gasket was pressed in and smooth and shiny. So this gasket sealed properly. Now then, accelerator pump, we've got a retaining bolt. This bolt is kind of special because it's hollow at this end and has a hole here and a hole up here. When the accelerator pump is activated, it shoots fuel through the inside of this bolt up through these two holes and down into the accelerator pump nozzles, which I'll show you in a moment. This is a metal plate that is used to help break up the airflow coming through there and atomize the gasoline being shot through the accelerator pump nozzle. Here are the pickup tubes for the fuel from the fuel bowl that come up over and are sitting down here waiting for pressure to send the fuel out. There's a gasket here. Now that retaining bolt at the top doesn't have to be tight, it has to be firm. If it's not, we get an air leak, which will cause a lean condition. Now, this is going to be a little harder to tell if the gas was sealing, because this doesn't have the same kind of complete perimeter sealing. If you see the high spots, it's only here and here, around 2 spots. And it looks like it was sealing properly. I can see where the seal is imprinted into the gasket for the pickup tubes and distribution. I don't see any indication that there was anything that wasn't sealing properly. I'll put that to one side. Here, this is nothing more than a small drop weight that sits on top of a little ball bearing down here. What that does is when the fuel is shot up to the center and then the throttle is closed, it keeps the fuel from draining back into the fuel bowl. So the drop weight puts a little tiny bit of weight on the small ball bearing sitting on top of a small seat. Put that to one side. Now, to get the ball bearing out of there, it's a little tricky. I'm going to spill some gasoline. That's what this is for, to help keep it from spilling too much. I'll put my finger over that hole. So when the ball bearing comes out, I can catch it.
More paper towel?
No. And now I'm going to try to grab that little ball bearing as it rolls out. Got it. There it is.
Little BB.
Yep. Now for the float, the needle in the seat. What this float does is as gasoline comes into the needle and seat and fills this bowl, it floats. And as it fills, it'll seal off the incoming gasoline with a small rubber or Viton tip needle. Sometimes these floats, especially these foam ones, will develop a leak and it'll sink, and then you have gasoline just pouring in. They can be adjusted for how high that float is set. And with most carburetor kits that I've seen, it'll have a specification for how much distance is between the flat of this air carburetor bowl upper edge and the top of the float. And so we have to make sure it's within specification. Otherwise, the car will run too lean or too rich, and it could cause drivability issues and or poor fuel economy. Now, holding this pivot pin is a small spring that is clipped onto a little notch at the top of the brass seat. So what I've got to do is get my little needleless pliers and carefully disconnect that retaining spring from the seat. And then I can lift the whole float assembly and hinge pin out and needle, and that's the rubber tip. Now in these older cars, these rubber tips are resilient and impermeable with gasoline, but with ethanol, especially over 10% mix, these rubber seals can become compromised and start to leak. When that happens, you start getting too much fuel inside the bowl, carburetor runs rich, yada yada yada, causes problems. So the newer rebuild kits now use a product called Viton or something similar to it that is impervious to gasoline and ethanol up to a certain degree. I don't know how much, but certainly 10% ought to be fine. This hangs off of a small tang on the float assembly. I'll put this to one side. The seat, I might be able to just get it off. Yep, sure can. The pliers aren't the right tool for the job, but they were convenient. And the rebuild kit should have a new seat and needle assembly anyway, so I'm fine popping it out the way I did. Anybody doesn't like it, do what you wish with the old carburetor. I went for what was quick because I forgot to bring over a nut driver for that. Now here, there's a small screen that is meant to keep any pieces that came through the fuel filter away from needle and seat, because any foreign material in there can cause fuel to slip by and the car will run rich. I have a friend with a 1974 Mustang 2 with a V6 in it, I believe. Maybe a 75 or 76, but whatever. It has a 2150 carburetor also, and he was having a problem with his needle and seat. A little different kind of problem, but caused that kind of problem is running way rich. And down here are two brass jets. I'm going to take those out. Now this screwdriver blade isn't really quite big enough to fit perfectly, but this is fitting good enough for me to get them off. Now these jets rarely have a problem, but I'd like to take them out when I dip the carburetor anyway. And once they're out, I'll blow through them and take a quick look to see if there is anything in there obstructing fuel flow. That looks clean. Put that to one side. This one looks clean to one side. Now there's a small number that is stamped into the top of these jets. Alphanumeric or numeric, I can't remember which, but it indicates how much fuel flows through there in a certain amount of time. For people who want to shed it leaner for high altitude use, that's important. I look at the bottom of the carburetor, I see a little bit of soft gunk down here in the bottom. That is probably residue from gasoline that dried up on the carburetor years ago. And now, because it's been soaking in gasoline, because we've been using the car, it is starting to soften up again. So I just mop it up. No big deal. It could come up by itself with the carburetor dip, but I was there, so I just went for it. Next thing I'm going to do is take off the accelerator pump cover. Quarter inch. Doesn't take a lot to tighten this down, just enough to get the gasket to seal and keep the nuts from backing out. A little bit of gasoline dribbles out, that's normal. I should have mentioned that before I came out. Well, this should give you a hint that something's going on down here. This diaphragm cover popped out. That's because there's a spring inside here. The Accelerator Pump return spring. So I take this last bolt out. I have to be careful not to lose it. As I don't recall if a new spring comes with these kits or not. If it didn't, I wouldn't be surprised. If it did, that would be a happy thing. And there it is. Return spring. Now here, I've got to remember which hole that went into. I'm going to mark it with my screwdriver just by putting a little notch down there. That's all. So it's slightly scored. So if I forget where that armlet is supposed to go, I can look and see.
Or you can watch the video.
Or I can watch a video. This is the Accelerator Pump diaphragm. One side is exposed to the air, has a small vent hole in the cover. The other exposed to gasoline. And the idea is as the accelerator pump is activated, the diaphragm goes out and sucks gasoline in from the fuel bowl through this little red seal. And when it goes in, it puts pressure on that, seals it, and shoots of fuel through this lower hole up into the accelerator pump cover where that hollow bolt was, and comes out those jets. I don't see any indication of leakage. It's wet on this side from gasoline, perfectly dry on this side. Sometimes these diaphragms will leak. When they do, this vent hole down here in the carburetor will have a leak, and you see liquid gasoline in front of the carburetor right underneath here. And the cause is that the diaphragm failed. Doesn't happen a lot until the cars get really old, 20 years or so. For 50 years old, this looks like it's in good shape. This may have been rebuilt once before. I can't really tell. I don't see indication one way or another. 21,000 original miles in the engine. I doubt it's ever been rebuilt. I take a look at the surface. I don't see a whole lot of dirt there, but that's not perfectly clean either. It's an indication that it's just normal exposure to air and gasoline and residues. This we dispose of. There's a new one inside the kit. This little check valve gets pulled through. To remove it, I simply take a pair of needle-nose pliers, put it around the base, and pull. If I'm lucky, it breaks off clean. It didn't. I got to pull it this way now. Now, I've got the diaphragm side, I've got the pull through, and what should be down here in the carburetor should be the little nub that held it in place. I've got all pieces. That gets replaced. Now, the best for last, power valve. That sounds pretty important. Anything that says anything about power should be causing a person to take interest. The power valve circuit in this carburetor designed so that when the vacuum of the intake manifold drops to a certain level, it adds more gasoline into air-fuel mixture. So when the throttle is open quite a bit, vacuum drops, this opens up, the fuel will come out through these two little slots in addition to what comes out through the Venturis. And it adds more gasoline to the air-fuel mixture to try to keep it somewhat rich during heavy acceleration. Well, the problem is that these power valves will sometimes begin to leak. When they do, it's an internal leak. So you don't really see any obvious signs of leakage like gasoline underneath the carburetor on top of the intake manifold. Rather, the vacuum pulls liquid gasoline past the diaphragm that's leaking through these ports, and the whole car runs real rich because you're dumping raw gasoline into the intake manifold. It doesn't have to be there. Typically when that happens, the engine will run sluggish, black smoke. You can't get the idle adjustment screws down tight enough to lean it out to have it adjust the idle mixture properly. It's too rich all the time. In extreme cases, it'll foul the spark plugs, turn them black, sooty black, misfires and all that. It can actually cause an engine to stop running, much less run well. When I take this apart, the top side should show evidence of liquid fuel. The bottom side should be dry. I see a little fuel here and there, but I don't see any inside here. So this power valve was not leaking. I take a look at the gasket and it looks to me like it's sealed properly all those years. I didn't have any indication that the power valve was a problem with this engine. The one time it was running rich was back when the electric choke circuit had failed. That caused a problem that acted like it could have been power valve. Power valve comes up, it's got a small gasket, and it's important to look at that gasket to make sure it was sealing properly and make sure there's no part of the gasket covering the fuel holes. There are different kinds of gasket designs depending upon what model the carburetor was. This gasket here is sticking to the power valve and not coming off clean. Well, first of all, I got a new power valve in the rebuild kit, so I don't care about that being reused. What I'm concerned about is making sure that this looks like it was sealing, and it does. And over here, surprise, surprise, someone has rebuilt this before and double gasketed this thing. Now, they might have done it thinking they were doing a good thing. It doesn't seem to have hurt anything, but there's no need to double gasket those things in my experience. Now, the person who rebuilt this might have either overlooked what they did or they did it on purpose because they thought it would seal better. Now, this old gasket material, I've got to make sure comes off, and when it comes off, it doesn't go back down inside the carburetor anywhere. Now, I can wait until I've soaked this to take this off, or since I'm seeing it and can get it off now, I'll do that. so there's less to worry about coming loose and getting inside a jet passage or some other fuel or air passageway and causing problems. So now that's nice and clean. The only thing left I really need to focus on now is the idle screws. Before I take them out, I want to see where they were set. How far in were they? So I'll turn this clockwise until it seats. 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5 turns. Normally when I preset these, I set them for about 2.5 to 3 turns. 4.5 turns seems a little bit high to me. That might unto itself be an indication that the vacuum leak that I saw evidenced by the carburetor gasket to the intake manifold wasn't completely tight. Could have caused that. It could have been a slight leak, and so this had to be rigined up about 2 turns more than usual. But the one side, the driver's side, is 4 1/2. These do not come in the carburetor kit. I had to reuse it with the spring. 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5. That was set for 5. A little bit richer. Now, the number of turns in there isn't necessarily an indication of how much fuel can flow past the idle adjustment screw for the idle air-fuel mixture, but is an indicator that the passenger side was a little bit richer than the driver's side. I take a look at the needle itself and look for any indication that this was set down too far, where I'd have a ridge in here. I don't see or feel any kind of ridge. Didn't on the other one either when I looked at it. So this looks like it's in good enough shape to go ahead and dip in the carburetor cleaner and get rid of all that junk. Oh, but wait. I have some gasket material on the base of the carburetor I am going to try to take off before I soak it. Again, because this way I can get rid of it before it gets softened up and maybe gets inside a jet somewhere or a passageway it doesn't really belong. So I will find a small putty knife and I'll just scrape these pieces off, get them away from the carburetor, and then dip it. When we're ready to dip it, we'll come back and show you how that looks. Look what Linda found sitting right next to me. A gasket scraper. It's got an angle with a flat edge and a beveled edge. And the idea is just to come along wherever I'm working at and start to work it. Now, I don't want to do anything that's going to mar the surface of the carburetor base plate, if I can help it. So far, it's basically skipping over a bunch of areas and not taking off the old gasket material, which tells me that was probably a low spot that the material was sitting on. Now here, I got a bunch taken away. I'm down to metal. I don't want to start getting it too much metal because there's more to seal. Just enough to get rid of the gasket material insofar as possible without causing a problem with the metal. I'm not trying to true the surface of the metal. I'd want to use a special machine for that to get it done right. I don't have that kind of machinery. And I don't have to get it perfectly clean. carburetor dip will help with that. Anywhere it still has gasket material that is evident because it's dark is a low spot in the casting that old gasket has filled. If it has little gasket material left behind, I'm not going to worry about it. I'll just figure that the new gasket will help fill in where it needs to, and I'm going to call it a day. But if I can get off some of this old stuff without causing a problem, I will. If you don't have a gasket scraper like this, you can use a nice new metal putty knife. But I'm not getting anything like sandpaper to sand it down. Now, we might find some folks that say you want to polish it as much as you can, get all metal if you can. I'm not going to say they're wrong. I'm just going to say that I have never had to. I get it as clean as I can. Let the carburetor cleaner do the rest of its job to soften up this old material, and if I can't get it off, I'll leave it to the new gaskets to provide the seal that we need, and it should do a fine job. Okay, I've gotten that about as clean as I can on that side. What about the top side? I just see some old residue that will be taken off. That all looks pretty good. I got one little part here I'm gonna just hit lightly. Yeah, I don't see a problem. Okay, now for my next trick. Oh, there's a part here I want to point out. If you take a look, there's a small piece of nylon here that helps keep dust from falling down into the choke linkage mechanism. It slides back and forth between the main body and the air horn. So when you put this together, make sure that this slides back and forth freely.
And that's okay to get dipped, that nylon piece?
Yep. Okay. 1 part of nylon, 1 bit. Okay. The carburetor dip I'm going to use is from Napa. There are some other good brands out there. You don't have to use Napa. I chose to use it because they had a 1-gallon can. Back in the old days, I used to get 2.5 or 3-gallon cans bigger than this for 4-barrel carburetors that would fit nicely. Now, what's really nice about this is that, first of all, it's coming from a quality parts reseller, Napa. So I know it's reputable. Other thing that's nice is it comes with a little metal basket. Huh, got some junk in there already. What's that black thing? Is that a bug? whatever it is, I'm going to pull it out because I don't need that inside the carburetor.
Looks like a bug.
Looks like it could have been.
Some bug had a bad death.
Yeah, that would have been a very cruel death.
That or a coffee bean. Somebody spilled their coffee bean in there. Want me to hold that?
There we go.
Nasty bug, this it was. Okay, I'm gonna move the drink away from all that crap.
I can go ahead and dip this carburetor in there with or without the basket. It's too big to fit in the basket of this size. Oh, guess what? Too small for the carburetor. Okay. You saw it here first. That is too small for a carburetor housing to fit in. That's just a 2-barrel carburetor. Well, luckily, I picked up some carburetor cleaner. If you go over there and see a spray can, that's it. Now, I got this in case I would need it. It is from another reputable brand, Gum Out. Because the carburetor is in such clean condition, I don't mind using only Gum Out to clean it up. Gloves. I'm not wearing gloves because I'm afraid of getting a little dirty. Some of these compounds can get through the skin and into the bloodstream. That happened to me a lot when I was younger, back before any of us knew any of that stuff was going on. I probably should have had them on. I pulled it apart, but the little bit of gasoline that I touched didn't have that much impact. I've been exposed to a whole lot more in the past. Of course, that might be why I got brain tumor. We'll never know. Anyway, I'm going to use this to loosen up any of the dirt and stuff on the outside and the underside of the air horn to begin with. I'm not looking to get this to be perfectly clean like a brand new carburetor. That's a little over the top. All I want to do is make sure that if there's any kind of residue, that I can help get rid of it before it becomes a problem. And there really wasn't much of a problem with this carburetor to begin with, other than the little bit of hesitation on light acceleration. And if that continues, then I'll go ahead and try to correct that by making adjustments to the accelerator pump rod. Okay, I'll have to take a look at this because it's important. Here we have some discoloration from residue, and up here, I had some here, I just blasted it and it went away.
It's getting us after it's spraying us.
Okay, I'm gonna get a paper, have Linda get a paper towel and mop this up and hope that it will loosen up some more of the debris. Okay, let me know when you're recording again.
I am. I already was.
Oh, good. Okay, some of the areas that were moist, I was able to clean off some residue. I'm going to re-moisten this again a little bit. Maybe you can tell that the liquid runs away from the parts that were a little bit discolored. Suddenly started getting clean looking. But that is just residual from normal operation being dissolved by the gum out and running off. And again, the idea isn't to get it so pristine that it's like it was brand new, but if I can get it to look a little cleaner and get some of this gum and residue off that built up over the years, it's fine. Now, from the angle of the camera, it's hard to see exactly how well this worked with the underside of the choke pleat. So you have to take my word for it, it made a difference. There was a little bit of residue, varnish and dirt from years ago that literally is not there anymore. Gone. It wasn't enough of a buildup to cause a problem, but with a couple of years of constant usage, that kind of varnish residue and dirt and dust can become an issue. If this was a customer's car, I would want it to look as clean as possible when it was done so they knew something happened if they happen to take off their filter housing. Oh wow, that looks like it's brand new. But functionally, I know a little bit of residue is nothing more than a place for layer residue to get a bit of a foothold and build up. That takes quite a while for it to build up, unless you're in a very dusty or dirty environment, in which case rebuilding or replacing the carburetor because of it getting contaminated and all built up on will become a routine matter of life. But for us, as little as we drive this thing, this might be the last time I got to rebuild this carburetor in my lifetime. That would be fine with me. Okay, this air horn is about as clean as I'm going to be able to get it.
Okay, I'll carry it with paper towel and put it on inside on paper towel.
Yeah, if you would, please. For the main body of the carburetor, I want to clean up choke and throttle linkage. That does have some accumulated dirt and grime, and shoot some of this gum out through the different channels to make sure that they're clear. So I'll start on the outside here. We have some residue build up. My guess is as soon as I hit this, it'll start to dissolve.
Yep.
Choke housing, choke linkage, front plate for dust, the little nylon slide. See if I can get some dirt off of that. Choke housing itself all look pretty good. Back here in the back of the carburetor, there is some residue from vapors. I'll be able to get it off pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, lots.
Anybody ever tells you gum out doesn't do a nice job? They're using it for the wrong job. Something like this, you can see how quickly it is dissolving the residue that I'm after. It's doing a very nice job. come around here to the linkage, and there's some grime and stuff inside this throttle return spring that's integral to the throttle shaft. This will likely have no impact at all on how well this carburetor runs. So this is really more visual than anything else. But, like I said, as a customer's car, I'd like them to see that something's different. Just in case they or someone else looked at the thing earlier, I don't want them to think, huh, he says it rebuilt it, but I don't see any difference. Well, rebuild means a few different things to different people. In my case, I'm simply replacing the gaskets and seals. Gotta check the float level, make sure that there isn't anything obviously wrong, like missing parts or something, and put it back together. It's not like I'm remanufacturing it. I don't make that claim. But I'm using something called a rebuild kit. And so since I'm installing it, I'd say I'm rebuilding the carburetor, not remanufacturing it. It's more preventive than anything else, and to make sure that any issues I might have don't become real issues. And again, because I was having a symptom of a little bit of hesitation on a light throttle acceleration. You don't want to be breathing these fumes.
You just got me with it.
Okay, now inside the Venturi throttle itself, I want to make sure that the transfer ports are clear, and they look like they are. The throttle blades appear to be nice and clean. Now, I checked to see if there's any excess carbon or wear where the throttle blades rest inside the Venturi bore. I see some evidence of wear, but no carbon buildup. The idle screw circuit, transfer ports, and intermediate ports look clear. I'm going to go ahead and start to shoot the solvent down into some of these channels just to make sure that if there's anything built up over the years, it gets cleaned out.
Fall off.
As I'm spraying these different channels, I'm looking for spray to come out another end, indicating that everything is working as it should. I have vent holes, I have bleed holes, I have fuel holes. None of them look like they are gunked up. Transfer ports. Intermediate port. Idle circuit. Okay, I'm pretty much done cleaning this as much as I can with the carburetor spray. Just to reiterate, I wasn't having any serious problems with the carburetor necessarily, but I was having a little bit of light throttle acceleration hesitation. After I get this adjusted for idle, I'll take it out and see if that hesitation is gone. If it's not, then I'll start making adjustments to the accelerator pump, actuating arm, and linkage until the problem goes away. If it doesn't go away, then it's something else. I've already checked the vacuum advanced diaphragm. That's been good. But I will probably end up double checking the timing and making sure that the diaphragm is working and port vacuum is getting down where it should, when it should, just to make sure if the problem still exists. Had this not been a 49-year-old car with 21,000 miles on it, I probably would not have rebuilt the carburetor because there's nothing indicating that there is a problem with it. Like symptoms of a ruptured power valve or something. And it surely was not gunked up. Had a little bit of residue, big deal. 49 years old. I got residue in me, I'm sure. Some of the smaller parts of the carburetor I put inside this basket and dipped them. And here they are. Now I could take water and a garden hose and rinse them off, or I'll just go ahead and blast it with this stuff and get the carburetor dip material out and off of those parts. Not that it hurts anything. Now, while that is drip drying, Linda, get me that top of the can.
Okay, keep that off your jeans.
And very lightly tap that.
All right, we don't need to video this because I can't do.
And now for the Venturi and Accelerator Pump assembly, I'm going to go ahead and blast that a little bit because I want to make sure that these ports are working the way they're supposed to. Can't see it on camera, but I can tell that those ports are clear. And everything looks copacetic or proper. Now there's a little bit of varnish buildup that come out is taking off that the carburetor dip itself did not. Sometimes it takes more than one technique to clean something up. Well, in this case, I probably could have just gotten by with dipping it for a longer period of time maybe, and using water to rinse off the carburetor dip compound, or I can do like I'm doing here. Use a little bit of gum out to polish up the effort. And it's not hurting a thing except maybe the grass underneath where it's dripping. In a day or two, that grass might be dead in that spot. But guess what? A few months from now, you'll never know. Okay, that looks pretty good. Rest of these parts, I'm going to spray that real quick just to get it cleaned up a little bit more. I see a little bit of residue in this one pickup tube for one of the Venturis, so I'll smack that a little bit more. See if I can get it polished up a little. Power valve cover. It goes underneath the carburetor and no one's ever going to see it unless I use a mirror or pull the carburetor off and look. But it's got a little residue in there that I can get out with a little bit of thumb grease, not even elbow grease, but thumb. Okay, we're going to go off camera, bring these things back in the garage and start to put the carburetor together. I now have the two brass fuel jets. They're interchangeable between the two holes in the base of the carburetor bowl, fuel bowl. I'm going to thread those in and then tighten them down. I did make sure that they were clean, and the carburetor spray will spray right through it, just like I checked all the different channels and passageways earlier. Now these are a little tricky to get started, and it is possible to accidentally drop one of these things through their power valve hole. So underneath the carburetor, I get a finger over the power valve hole, so if the jet drops down there, I have a good chance of getting it back. I got a wider blade screwdriver. Make sure the tip is clean, so I don't end up getting something inside the jets that I don't need or want. And then once it's in the slot, just make sure it's tight. Done. Now then, time to start to reassemble this. And like anything else, it's not that as hard just tedious. So I want to see what parts this carburetor kit includes, so I know what I gotta do next. If I need to order anything like that thicker carburetor base plate gasket. Look, instructions. This will include the specifications for the float height setting. I do not see a thick base plate gasket, so if I need one, I'll order it. I'm going to try to scrape the old gasket off of both sides.
That's this big thing?
Yeah.
That's this thing here, didn't come with it.
So now I'm going to try to find the year, the model, and the engine size.
You gotta actually look at instructions.
1972 truck, 73 Comet Cougar Maverick Mercury, Mustang Ranchero Torino, 302 engine. There are two of them that have automatic transmission, and it specifies the tag ID for each. Carburetor number D30F EA, automatic transmission. That's the tag I've got. The dry float level, 7/16 of an inch. Fast idle RPM, 1400. Okay, the big thing for me is 7/16 of an inch for the float, dry float measurement. And in here, they have a small ruler. I could replace this hinge retaining spring on the float hinge pin, but it's the same exact part that I show in here. I'm not going to worry about it. The new seat and gasket. This will be the first time I've assembled a carburetor with gloves on.
Why are you?
Back in the old days, we didn't have these gloves available. I'm doing it now simply because they're already on. If this becomes too complicated, I'll take them off because I am used to tactile response when I do stuff like this. Okay, the seat is in place, but I have to tighten it down. All right, the gloves come off, so to say. Oops. Lots of perspiration in there because my hands could not breathe when the gloves were on, so they didn't stay dry. They got wet from perspiration. Now then, I want to get the proper size socket to tighten that seat down. Found it first try. The is in place. I have the gasket, the new gasket underneath. I'm going to tighten this down. It doesn't have to be overly tight, just snug so it doesn't back off by itself later on. I don't have to make things difficult for anybody else by making it rigged. I want to start to put together the parts for the accelerator pump. We have a little baggie of parts. Some of those parts are gaskets. I'm going to try to be very careful not to damage that. This one takes a little bit of consideration. There's a center hole that this rubber piece goes through. I go ahead and use these pliers to grab the tail and pull. That little nub comes through. And now this one-way check valve is in place. Now I put the float in there.
Are you sure?
I hope so. There's only so many parts of this thing. Back in the old days, I would have had this thing running already and adjusting it. That was then, this is now. Okay, it's back in place. Make sure it's not moving. And then make sure that this comes up. Now, I check for the dry height. I'm going to see where this tells me to measure from for the float drop. 1973 D30VA 7/16 of an inch is the dry float level. And that is measured by me lightly pressing down on the needle. It says do not exert pressure on the needle valve, so just hold it down gently until the seat or the needle is seated, and then measure from the top of the bowl to the top of the float toe end. 7/16 of an inch.
Another tragedy is my battery's about to go dead, so we're going to switch phones in a sec.
This float is way, way too low. It's at 16/18, 16/32 of an inch. It's supposed to be 7/16, so that has been running very lean. That unto itself could be why we had that slight hesitation, because when I looked at this earlier, I thought it looked like the float was a little bit too low. And it turns out I was right. So to adjust it, I need to carefully bend the tang over here on this side of the pivot arm without exerting any force on the float, because a float, if I do anything that damages the seal, well, I'm in trouble. I don't want to do anything that'll damage that seal, because then the float will get heavy, absorb gasoline, and sink. And then we got a bigger problem than a low float level. So here I will take off the retaining tang, I will move the needle to one side, and then I want to have this float go up higher, which means that this tang has to come up. So I will hold this between my thumb and forefinger at this hinge point with my thumb across the metal over here, and very carefully bend this up a little tiny bit. It doesn't take much. More than that for sure. See if that was enough. Back in here. I can see a difference already.
Yeah.
So
you gotta put the bracket on to know for sure.
I'm going to snap it in place. The retaining wire. And measure again. That looks better already. So I'm after 7/16, just one nick up from this 8 mark. Oh, I'm supposed to go even higher. Wait a second. 8, 37. I'm going to double check.
I think you said 7/16.
I'm pretty sure I did.
That's a 71 Ford.
Seven 16s, be 14 30 seconds. So be 12 and 16.
To 12.
It's actually a little more than 12, not quite 16. We're in a lot closer than before, so I'm going to leave it right where it is. I had a physician once tell me the enemy of good is better. This is a lot better than it had been. It had been way down here.
Yeah.
Now it's supposed to be 14, 30 seconds or 7/16. And I say it is right in the money right there. If I push on the seat hard, I can make it go up a little higher. But it had been way down here. The low float level, it would have helped with better fuel economy, but we'd always be running a little lean. And when we step on the accelerator pump, it takes a little bit longer for the fuel to get where it's supposed to be going to the Venturis. And so the action of the accelerator pump would have been wasted to a large degree. I'm happy with this. Now the other thing is, if we didn't have a float adjustment table, the idea was to get the float top parallel to the top of the carburetor housing, a little higher to be rich. This is a little higher than parallel, but when I measured it, it came in about where it should have been. I'm going to leave it. The other part of the accelerator pump, where that little basket go?
What little basket?
Down here.
Oh, cleaner basket.
I have Venturis and Accelerator Pump. Now, before I pull this apart, I looked down the throat of the carburetor, hit the throttle, and saw fluid came out of these two small brass nozzles for the accelerator pump. It came out nicely, snap, snap, no problem. When I cleaned this up, after dipping it, I used gum out and shot through the little brass nozzles and made sure I was getting output, and I was. So I am confident this is ready to be assembled. What I'm going to look for is the gasket for the Venturi set. And I'm going to drop it carefully into place. Not yet, hold on. Trying to think of the old days again. I need to get that little tiny check ball, drop it carefully. It's down there in the accelerator pump well. I can see it when I look down there. And then it came initially with a small drop weight that goes back in kit. I kept all these parts up here just in case I might need them. There we go. Much thinner diameter. This does not wear. It has a contact point at the ball, check ball at one end. Technically, I guess we could say it is wearable, but any wear on there will be almost insignificant. Okay. This little piece. Well, this is a slightly rubberized coating on here, it looks like. There was no gasket. There is a gasket of some sort in the kit, but I don't think it's for this. I'll take a look anyway. Possible. I will use it just in case. Won't hurt a thing.
Let's put this in first.
Goes down like so.
hear that ball, or shouldn't you hear it?
I should be able to hear it if I had my ears working like I did back when I was in my 20s, but I don't.
Do it, let me hear it.
You won't be able to hear it, all background noise.
I hear it.
If I don't get this tight, I'll have a fuel leak. I don't want that. Got a small sliver of metal in my finger somewhere. I can feel it every once in a while. The base of the spring has to go around that red part, otherwise it'll hold it shut. We don't want that. So that's what I'm going to be looking out for with my next couple of steps. I marked this so I could see where the linkage used to go. I remember anyway. I'm glad I marked it to make sure. So that's how that goes together.
But that spring's got to fit in
The
there.
spring has to go in there and the gasket. So now, being tedious once again, I look for the gasket with the pump, and there it is. Gasket and diaphragm for the accelerator pump. This is always a lot of fun to put together. Very tedious, as I recall and as I'm experiencing right now.
How do you know it's seated in there properly, like the spring?
When we get gasoline in here, hit the throttle and watch it squirt. as before, tight without being too tight. We don't need to strip out these threaded holes in the body of the carburetor. Ow. It's actuating properly. Fluid-wise, we'll see if it's working properly. Once we have gasoline in here, we can look down the throttle as we open it up and see it squirt out of the Accelerator pump holes. We'll know better once we have it together. I'm sure it'll work fine, but I'd like to see before I get too crazy and go for a road test.
More towards me.
Power valve. Well, I should have left it upside down. The power valve, nothing's going to fall out. Better not. Power valve gasket. Power valve. Put it in place. And it's not covering up either of the jet holes, the rectangular jet holes. So that's how I want this thing to be when I put it in place. Want to make sure it's squared up all the way around. And it is, so it's set sitting centered, not cockeyed. Like all the other stuff, tight without being overly tight. Don't have to crush the gasket. Power valve cover gasket. That's choke housing.
Need it?
Yeah. Probably not actually, but I don't have it. Gasket. It may not make any difference functionally for the power valve itself, but it might for access to the air fuel mixture screws. And as I recall, it's not for the screws themselves, but rather it's for some idle speed limiter caps that used to come on these things that we couldn't make an adjustment more than one turn or 7/8 of a turn from factory, lean or rich. And boy, wasn't that fun to have to deal with. So many years since I've worked on these things. Okay, you can pause that for a little bit. Idle screw needles. I run them down to the bottom. Not hard, just enough to say seat, and then I back it off. I'm gonna back them off 4.5 turns because one of them was 4.5, the other one was 5.
That one was 5, the other was 4.5.
There. 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5. That's a good place to start. And just seated. 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4.5. Okay, that's my starting point.
And you can play with those once the car is back together?
Yes, I have a special screwdriver for that,
Gotcha.
which when I get ready to adjust it, I'll show. Fuel filter. Before I put it on, I would like to put some Teflon tape on here. The Teflon tape is not intended to keep it from leaking. It is not a leak prevention material. It is here to lubricate the threads, nothing more, nothing less. That it happens to be good at stopping leaks is a nice side benefit, but that isn't the real purpose for having it. Is to make sure that the threads are lubricated, dry lubrication. And it doesn't take a whole lot. I usually go around it twice. Snap it off. And then judiciously start to tighten it up. That's why I brought the 15/16. Tight enough is tight enough. When I get this installed and I crank the engine over, it'll shoot fuel inside here. And when the bowl shuts off the needle in the seat, the fuel from the fuel line between the fuel pump and the carburetor needle seat will build up pressure. If there is a fluid leak, it'll show up, in which case I will loosen the clamp a little bit and tighten this a little more until the fuel leak stops. I don't think I'll need to do that. When we had rebuilt this carburetor and put it back on the car and started the engine, we had a bit of fuel leaking from the fuel filter where the inlet was into the base of the carburetor. Somebody previously had run that fuel filter in really far. Probably wasn't necessary unless someone before that ran in pretty far and hogged out the threads. So rather than try to bottom out a fuel filter into the housing, I got a new filter. Even though this is perfectly good, I was thinking maybe these threads here got a bit crushed from being put in so far. So maybe a new filter will fit a little tighter. I put more Teflon tape around the threaded end. Not that I've done that to try to stop a leak, because that's not what Teflon tape or thread seal is supposed to do. It's supposed to lubricate the threads, but it can help stop a leak. And then I went over to our parts store and got some O-rings. And the O-ring that I got has a center diameter just big enough to go around the threaded part of the fuel filter. After I did that, I tightened the filter into the housing of the carburetor until I could see that the O-ring made contact. I went a little bit further to put a little pressure on it, but not so tight as to crush it. So now we're looking at a situation where hopefully the fuel leak is gone. If it persists or comes back, because this O-ring, even though it's supposed to be impervious to gasoline, if I ever get any ethanol in there, it could cause it to corrode. But I have some Viton O-rings somewhere in our garage. I would need to find that and put that on the filter. Meantime, yesterday, I went to a car show, drove all the way there and back. I could smell gasoline. So to see if it's leaking or not, at this point, what I've done is I hooked up a starter relay button to the starter relay. I've disconnected both the S terminal for start and the I terminal for ignition. The reason I took off the I is because when I cranked manually, normally this will carry current down to the ignition coil, providing full battery voltage while the engine's being cranked, about 9.5 to 10 volts. And the engine will attempt to start. I do not need or want it to try to start. All I want to do is crank it to get the fuel pump working, put some pressure up here to see if there's a fuel leak. I'd rather do it cranking than running, because if it's running it's leaking fuel, I'll have more fuel come out than I want. So with that, I'm going to crank this over a couple of times and I'll check with my finger and see if it is still dry. Right now, it's bone dry. I hope it stays that way. Here we go.
It's dripping from the,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's somewhere else.
Yeah, not where we thought it was.
You know what? That is a leak from here.
In that clamp?
I think so. Do you have a paper towel?
I'm gonna turn this.
Wait, there's more.
There's more.
Let me explain. We had a leak in a new area, and I took off the clamp thinking maybe the clamp is too large a diameter for this fuel line. The size clamp says it's for 5/16 to 7/8 inch hose. That's a 5/16 fuel line hose. It should have worked. If it had been too big a hose, the saddle, which the tightening screw goes into, has an arc that would not be tight enough to seal properly if it is too large a hose clamp. So I took the clamps off to see what the saddle looked like. And if you take a look at this one, I'm gonna put it up against the white background. On the one side of the saddle inside, you'll see some of the clamp strap.
I'm going to point to it.
The clamp strap is bent almost 90 degrees,
Right.
and that would have been inside
It's sticking up.
the clamp surface into the outside diameter of the rubber hose. That would have been enough to distort the rubber hose to keep it from clamping consistently around the whole inside circumference. Well, I had another clamp. I took it out, took off the other clamp, and made sure that there was no further little tang inside. Put them on, tied them down, but I did not tie them down to where it's crushing anything. I just want to make sure it was tight enough so if I tried to turn the clamp and hose, I couldn't. That's all the sealing I need. No more. I also checked for fuel leak where it used to be on the inlet, where we now have the O-ring helping close that. It's all dry. So, a lot of work for a small fuel leak, but no fuel leak is a good fuel leak.
I see no leaks.
Dry fingers, still dry, still dry, still dry.
Good.
Okay, we nailed it
Alrighty.
so far. So what I'll do next is I'll start this up, warm it up, back it out of the garage so the exhaust gas doesn't gork us out. And I'm gonna hook up our oscilloscope to the engine and do what's called a scope and set on the engine, where I make sure the initial timing for the distributor is correct, and then I'm going to set the idle speed of the engine in its normal mode, and then I'll unplug the throttle position solenoid so that the carburetor drops down to even lower idle. I'm looking for 450, 425. And the reason for that is when the car is running normally, that solenoid will hold the throttle open enough to run at, say, 650 RPM in drive, idling. But if we put the car in neutral, shut it off, these older engines that were set a little bit lean from the factory for emission control purposes would sometimes diesel or run up, even though the ignition is turned off. But to help minimize that, Ford put in these throttle position solenoids. So I turn off the engine, the solenoid collapses, the throttle closes a little bit more, and it reduces the propensity for dieseling or run-on. The other thing they started using those things for was on air-conditioned cars, where with the air conditioner turned off, the solenoid wouldn't be engaged. It would be off. Set the carburetor idle at 650 RPM or 600, whatever spec is for the car. When the air conditioner goes on and you open the throttle a little bit, the solenoid is energized and it'll hold the idle open about 75 or 100 RPM higher than normal to help offset the air conditioning compressor. Now, this air conditioner, this is not the way this car works. This is the anti-diesel mode. But other cars do have a setup where those are activated when the air conditioning compressor is turned on. Now, This is not a factory air conditioning compressor. It's aftermarket. It causes a lot less compression and takes a lot less energy from the engine, so when it's on, it has less of an impact on reducing the idle speed. So even if we have this set up with the solenoid that works with the air conditioning compressor, I would probably not get too worried about setting that to much higher RPM than normal with that kind of compressor. Anyway, I'll get more into that in a few minutes after we get this outside and warmed up, connected to the scope. Okay. Now that we have the carburetor back on the engine and the fuel leak stopped, it's time to go ahead and do what I call scope and set. Scope. I use that term because I'll be using an oscilloscope, which will give a visual representation of the electrical system for the ignition, primary and secondary ignition for the car, the engine. Set, because I'll be checking and setting as necessary the initial timing before top dead center for distributor and ignition, the off solenoid idle position, the on solenoid idle position, and I'll be setting the air fuel mixture screws for idle on the carburetor. Now I suspect that they were set pretty rich because there had been a vacuum leak on the right front corner of the carburetor because someone didn't tighten that nut down. When I looked at the faceplate gasket, I saw that part of the gasket was smooth. It wasn't crushed like the rest of the gasket was. So to offset or compensate for that vacuum leak, someone had to set those idle screws a bit richer than normal. And the idle speed of the engine is lower now than before because it doesn't have that vacuum leak in there. So I got a couple of things to do, but before I do any of that, there's one thing I want to test first, and that is the vacuum advanced diaphragm on the distributor. Now I've checked this before and it was good. Doesn't mean it's still good, it's been a year. But I like to check that before anything else, because I have to unplug it anyway to set the ignition timing. So I unplugged the vacuum hose leading to it, and I plug in a vacuum hose going to my vacuum tester. I say I'm going to do it. The hose has to fit first. There we go. So what I'm looking for is when I apply vacuum, the needle should go up and should stay steady. It's got a slight leak. Now I got to find out, is it a leak in my equipment? Yes, that was loose.
Oh,
Try that again. Yep, holding steady. The diaphragm is not leaking. That does not mean necessarily to say that it is working. It is possible that the diaphragm might be holding pressure, but that the linkage is not working inside the distributor. So I'm going to test for that a little later. Boy, that pumped off kind of easy. Put that back on, because I'll be using it later. Yep, it's good. The other thing I'll be testing for when this engine starts is I want to make sure that the vacuum that's supposed to be coming down to this hose off the ported vacuum switch or turbo vacuum switch is working. The way I'm going to do that is with the vacuum gauge connected to that port. And then when the engine is running, I'll open the throttle. I'll be looking for that gauge to move when I'm off idle. When I close the throttle, it should drop back down to 0. There. Okay, I'm going to get in the car or to the ignition switch and start the engine, and then I'll go over this stuff.
Want me to do that and you hold this?
Oh, good.
Okay.
Now, if you listen to the engine, it sounds like it's running kind of slow, and it is. Look at the tachometer, it's running at 400 RPM at idle in park. Way too low for normal idle. That's because the idle has not been reset by the throttle position solenoid. I'll demonstrate that. The throttle position solenoid is located right here. When the engine is off, this collapses and lets the engine idle drop. When the engine starts, as soon as it opens the throttle up, this will lock into a higher position, and you see the RPM go up. Now we're at the RPM, and it's almost 600 RPM. Now, when the engine shuts off, we lose power to the solenoid. I'll demonstrate what happens by unplugging it. And the RPM drops again to 400. That is to keep the engine from running on after the ignition is turned off. They close down the idle speed with the throttle plate to choke it from happening. Now plugging this back in does not increase the RPM. The solenoid isn't strong enough to push that up. Someone's got to hit the throttle first with their foot. Now it's back up. Now we're running at about 580 RPM or so. We want 650 in drive, that'd be about 730 in neutral or park. Before I adjust the throttle position solenoid to increase the speed, I'm going to adjust idle mixture screws because I suspect they're too rich right now. Go ahead.
Recording.
Okay, this is a special screwdriver with a cable inside the metal sheath, and when I turn the knob at one end, it turns the head at the other. This is made to adjust the screws on this carburetor because they're really hard to reach. Okay, I'm turning. Richard. Okay.
It's a 6.
I turned it to the right to lean it out as the RPM came up, then it dropped off. I turned it richer again to come a little higher. About a half turn altogether. Do the same thing on the other side. What I am looking at to my right on the fender is the timing light, which has a digital tachometer. And as I'm adjusting the idle mixture screws, I'm looking to see the impact on the engine idle speed. Alright, I've got the idle mixture set, and now on the tachometer shows about 600 RPM. So by leaning it out a little bit, I picked up 20 RPM, which is about what I expected. Now I'm going to set the solenoid activated idle speed. It's supposed to be set in drive, but I don't have to put it in drive. I'm going to set it in park or neutral, go in the car, put it in drive, and see if it comes in to 650 RPM or not. I'm going to set this about 720 RPM. I'll do that. Small wrench on this carrier screw that the solenoid is mounted in. That is about 750 RPM. So I'm going to try to drive. Okay, that on the car tachometer showed about 620 RPM. A little bit low. I'm going to move it up a little bit. Try again. That came in about 635 RPM. That's close enough for me. I like between 600 and 650. Now, I'm going to double check the ignition timing. But before that, I'm going to check the port vacuum, make sure it's working. Watch that needle. It's not working, so I gotta find out why. Not plugged in. I'll try. Okay, quarter vacuum works. I'm going to come around. Now I'm going to apply vacuum to the vacuum advanced diaphragm with the engine running, and the RPM should increase. Go ahead and get a shot of that tachometer.
This guy.
Yes, here I go. And it worked. So that tells me that the vacuum advanced diaphragm is working. Now this is an initial timing light. Every time spark plug number 1 fires, it lights up this tube. I point this down here at a timing marker. I'm looking for it to say how far advanced the dish timing is. This is really hard to see. Okay, I am retarding the spark by 6 degrees electronically. I marked that vibration dampener to 0 degrees and it's right on the money. If I move this up to 0 degrees advanced, this will show 6 degrees advanced on the timing mark on the balancer. It's a good setting. So that's done. The other thing that's good to check.
Right, come on here.
On the scope.
Watch your hand.
See if I can get it on here. The dwell. Should be 33 to 34 degrees dwell. We're right on 33 degrees, so the point gap is good. For some reason,
This went off.
that went off.
Yeah.
It had been working.
Got a little bit of something there. Got a light.
Alright, I'm not going to be able to show what I wanted to show. I'll turn it off and back on, see if it makes a difference. Scope's not working. I was going to show the visual representation of the spark plug voltage and some of the patterns to look for, but I guess I'll get this thing fixed first. 60 years old, I forgive it.